How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Tezayin, Daf 16 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, Daf 16 is interesting Daf. Daf 16 is interesting Daf. The first section of Daf 16, we discuss slaughtering with a muchni. Do you remember what a muchni is? A muchni is some kind of a rotating blade. So we're going to see different angles of slaughter with a muchni slaughter. It might be slightly more interesting than you might expect. Slightly. We discussed disconnected and then connected items. What if you have something that was, we discussed, for example, if you take a knife that is not attached to the wall and then you connect it to the wall and then you want to use it for shechita. Is it considered like part of the ground, like part of the earth? Or is it considered like disconnected from the earth? We're going to talk about walls and buildings, right? Things that are permanent structures. Are they considered like a mountain, or are they considered disconnected? We are going to see this in the context of avodah zarah, in the context of hechsher zroyim, machshirin, second time in a week, machshirin. What exciting stuff! And then in the context of shechita, and finally, slaughtering with a knife connected to the wall. How to? So this is obviously really exciting stuff. And friends, let's jump in. Let's enjoy ourselves and learn together Daf 16, Daf Tezayin of Masechta Chullin. And we begin on Daf Tezayin Omid Aleph, second line of the Omid. Amar Marvi said, "Ashaychid b'muchni," somebody who slaughters with a muchni, and that's like a rotating blade. Okay, so you have some kind of blade that's on some kind of a wheel, and the wheel turns, and the blade blades, and the animal neck gets sliced open. Exciting times. Kshera, we say that is kosher. However, we have a conflicting brisa. In the conflicting brisa, it says the opposite, which is that a muchni, a shechita via muchni, is a psula shechita. It's not allowed. Lo kasha, not to worry. Ha bisarna de fachra, ha bisarna de mayo. Very interesting. So it depends how the wheel is turning. If it is a potter's wheel. Now, do we have any potters at Babble on Talmud? Come on, I feel like we got to have a potter here. I just feel like maybe someone's a potter here at Babble on Talmud. Akoponim, I imagine that at this day and age, a potter's wheel is probably electric, is my guess. I don't know. But anyways, I don't know. I know very little about pottery making. I am aware that there is a wheel that is used. I think maybe I watched a few YouTube videos. You take like a clump of clay and you put it on the wheel and it turns in circles, and then you start shaping it as it's turning in circles. So you need this wheel to be turning and turning and turning and turning. So there are be'etzem two ways to power the wheel. This, of course, we're assuming without the electricity version, although even the electricity version, it doesn't necessarily have to be that much different, but let's assume not an electricity version. So in that case, you essentially are powering the wheel. You have to get it to turn. I saw this YouTube video yesterday of it said it was an ancient pottery technique. It looked like the person doing the technique was ancient themselves. They kind of took a stick essentially and got it spinning, and then they would move, kind of shape the clay. But the point is, so if this is like a potter's wheel, so in our case it's a shechita wheel, so you have this wheel that turns and it's got a blade on it. If a human is controlling the turning, the spinning of the wheel with the blade on it, so then essentially we view it as a human that is affecting the shechita, and it's kosher. There is another option that you can have this wheel that's connected to like a water, like when you have like those windmills and you have the water, the current of the water kind of turns this wheel, which is connected to like gears, which turn like a mill stone or something, or in this case, it turns the shechita wheel. So if it's being powered by a water flow, essentially, so no human force is needed to get the shechita wheel turning, it's all happening via the flow of water, well then the human isn't doing anything to affect the koach of the knife, and that's why it's puzzle. So we say not to worry. The answer is, if the shechita wheel, if the knife wheel is being spun by a person, then it's kosher. If it's being spun by water current, it is unkosher. Givaldi. So again, Loikasha, it's not a problem. Ha besarna de fachra, a potter's wheel, which needs to be turned by human turning, so that is kosher. Ha besarna de maya, but a water wheel, which is turned by a water current without any human force required, that would be posel shechita, because you need a human to be involved in the force of the shechita, in the movement of the knife. And in this case, that's accomplished through turning the wheel. The ibai sema, alternatively, ava bisarna demaya, you can actually explain how it could be kosher even with the water wheel, and that is v'lokasha ha b'koyach rishon ha b'koyach sheni. This is interesting. So imagine that you don't necessarily want the wheel with a very sharp blade on it to be spinning 24/7. You really only need it to spin when you need to use the wheel. So let's assume that it's a shechita wheel. So you only need the wheel to be spinning when you have an animal or a bird to shecht. So when you don't need this very sharp knife spinning around, this very sharp blade spinning around, so what you could do is, so we're talking about a water wheel, a water-powered knife wheel. So what you could do is you could block the water current from the water wheel, and if you block the water current from where the water wheel, that right, the water current that turns the wheel, which then goes and turns the knife wheel. I didn't get a photo of this. I was thinking about getting a photo of this. I just assumed that we kind of all know what this looks like. I don't know. Did we all, like, when we were like 10 years old, did our school take us all to like some colonial village where they had these kind of water wheel kind of things? Probably, right? Akoponim. I think I once went with my grandparents. I think Bubby and Zeta. And these Zeta once took us to one of those colonial villages where you go to the blacksmith. So I was a blacksmith. Interesting. Making horseshoes. Akoponim. So the water wheel. So you block the water wheel, and if you block the current from reaching the water wheel, so then the water wheel won't spin. And then when you want the blade wheel to blade wheel, so you unblock the current, which will then turn the wheel, which will in turn, I guess, turn the blade wheel. So that is to say that initial spin of the blade wheel, when you unblock the current, that initial flow of current is going to turn the water wheel, which will in turn turn the blade wheel. That first turn of the blade wheel was affected by the human, right? That's what's called koach rishon, the initial force of the human by removing the impediment to the water current, to the current of water. And that initial current of water, which turns that water wheel the first time, which in turn turns the blade wheel, that first turn, that was caused by the person. And if you, for that first turn, press, you probably don't want to press, but if you, for that first turn, apply the blade wheel to the neck of an animal and slice it right open. So if it's that first turn, it'll be a kosher shechita, even with a water wheel, because that first turn is coming from you having done something, you having removed the blocker from the water wheel. But once already it comes to the second turn already, that's no longer the person's force, that's already the water current doing its thing, and at that point it will be possible. Let's read that again. Alternatively, I will suggest you can explain that it could even be kosher with the water wheel. V'loi kasha, it's not a problem. Ha b'koyach rishon or b'koyach sheni. If we're talking about shechting an animal with the initial force of having removed the blocker of the current and that initial revolution of the blade wheel, you slaughter an animal, it is kosher. But subsequent turns will be unkosher since it is not coming from the koach of a person. From that point on, it is coming from the koach of the water current. And it's like Rav Papa hot gizokt. It's like Rav Papa said, Haiman de kafte lechavre. Ruvain tied up his friend Shimon. Ve'ashkil ole bitka demaya, and then unloaded, released upon him a surge of water, vamis, and his friend Shimon drowned. Chayev, Ruvain will be chayev for that. My time, how come? Gire dide hu da'ahanibe. It's considered like his arrows that he shot at his friend Shimon. Vanimile b'koyach rishon, but this is by the koach rishon, about b'koyach sheni grome be'alma hu. This is only by the koach rishon, but by the koach sheni it's grome be'alma. Meaning, if Ruvain ties up his friend Shimon, and he places his friend Shimon right next to a dam, and the dam is blocking water, and Ruvain ties up his friend Shimon, and he places him mamish right next to the dam, and Ruvain then opens up the dam, and a surge of water pours over Shimon and drowns him to death. Ruvain will be chayiv for that because it's coming from his koyach. It's coming from he opened up the dam. Immediately, that initial burst of water burst onto Shimon, killing him. That is, it's Reuven's chayev misa for that, right? He killed Shimon. However, if Reuven tied up his friend Shimon and put him downstream, further downstream, and it was dry at the time, Reuven then opens up the dam, and sure, there's an initial burst of water, but Shimon isn't there yet. Shimon is downstream. And now, after that initial burst of water, the water is now flowing on its own, and flowing and flowing and flowing, until it eventually reaches Reuven's friend Shimon, killing Shimon. At that point, in that scenario, even though, sure, the water only eventually ended up at Shimon because Reuven opened up the dam, however, it's considered a grama. Right? Since it's not that initial burst that killed Shimon, that initial burst that was caused by Reuven opening up the dam, it was a result of Reuven opening up the dam. Reuven opened up the dam, which created, sure, an initial burst, but then that, then after that initial burst, it just became a sort of current and a flow of water, and it's that flow of water that eventually arrived and killed Shimon. So in that case, it would be considered a grama. Reuven caused the death, but he didn't directly affect the death, and he will be potter from misa there. So again, v'chiyah de omer Papa, it's like what Papa says, Haiman de kafte lechavre. If Reuven ties up his friend Shimon, v'ashkil ole bidka demaya, and then unloads upon him a current, a burst of water, vamis, and Shimon dies like that, chayiv, Reuven is chayiv. My time, how come gire dide hu de ahani bey, basically shot his arrows at his friend Shimon. But that's for it if we're talking about the initial burst. If Reuven had tied up his friend Shimon and put him right next to the dam, so that when Reuven opened up the dam, that initial burst that was immediately right away unleashed by Reuven having taking action and opened up the dam, if that initial burst killed Shimon, Reuven is chayav for that. Aval b'koyach sheni, but if it's a secondary result, a secondary force, i.e. Shimon is further downstream, and it takes time for the current to make its way to Shimon, well then grama ba'almahu, it would just be considered a grama, a causation, and Reuven would be potter from the capital punishment in that case. Yosef Rav Achored Reb Chia, Rav was sitting behind his uncle Reb Chia, Reb Chia Kami the Rebbe, and Reb Chia was sitting in front of his Rebbe. The Yosef Rebbe v'kamer, and Rebbe was saying. Now, friends, if you remember yesterday, we had a machlokes between Reb Chia and Rebbe. Reb Chia had said that lichatchila you can use a knife that is connected to the ground. Reb Chia had said that. Rebbe said at most it's b'di'evet. V'Yosef Rebbe v'kamer, and Rebbe then said, "Minayin l'shchita shi b'talish." How do we know that shchita must be done with something that is disconnected from the ground? Shenemar vayikach es hamaycheles, that Avram Avinu took the knife. He took the knife lishchait to slaughter his son Yitzchak. So because Avram used the knife and the knife is disconnected from the ground, we have to use something that's disconnected from the ground. Amalei Rav Reb Chia Maika Omer. Rav says to Reb Chia, can you explain to me what Rebbe is talking about? Amalei Reb Chia says, Vav dichsiv a'ufsa kamar. No, I can't. What Rebbe is saying is like a letter Vav that is written on a tree trunk. If you've ever seen a tree trunk, it's got like grooves in it. The tree trunk is not smooth. Depends on the tree, I guess, but like a tree kind of tree. Like an oak tree or something. Yeah, I think, let's see, let me quickly look up an oak tree. Let me make sure. Oak tree. Is this the tree that I'm talking about? Okay, let me get a good, they have acorns. Yeah, oak tree. Yeah, oak tree. For sure. Yeah, oak trees are not smooth. So imagine you write the letter Vav on an oak tree, it'll be all broken up because the oak tree, the outside of it the bark is unsmooth. There's lots of there'll be a lot of cracks in the letter Vav. Says Reb Chia, Rebbe said something that has a lot of cracks in it. That's obviously because Reb Chia disagrees with Rebbe. Rebbe was trying to bring a raya for why the shechita has to be done with something disconnected from the ground. Reb Chia doesn't agree with that. Anyways, so Rav says his uncle Reb Chia, what was Rebbe saying? Reb Chia says, Vav dichsib a'uf sukamer. He was saying the equivalent of the letter Vav that is written on a tree trunk. It will have cracks in it. Rebbe said something that has cracks in it. V'akra ka'amar. The Gemara asked, wait, what do you mean? He quoted a pasuk. How could Reb Chia discard it? Kra zvizuse davram kamaj malon. Reb Chia would say that pasuk by Avram Avinu is not proving that you need to use something disconnected from the ground. It's showing the zrizis of Avram Avinu. That Avram Avinu by Akedas Yitzchak, he did not want to leave anything to chance. That maybe he would get to Hira Moriah and there wouldn't be an implement for shchita there. So it's saying that Avram Avinu brought his own shchita knife to make sure that he would have what he needed to fulfill the mitzvah of Akedas Yitzchak. That's what it's saying. But it's not saying, according to Reb Chia, it's not saying that you have to use something disconnected for the ground. Reb Chia would disagree with that conclusion. And now we move on to the next section of today's daf, disconnected and then connected items. We are going to see this in the context of Avodah Zorah, in the context of Hechsher Zroyim, in the context of Shchita. Here we go. Amar Rove says, Rove, Pshitali, it is obvious to me. Talosh ulvasoif chibro, something that is disconnected and then connected. Le'inyan, we'll talk about this in a second. Le'inyan avodas kechovim, when it comes to avodah zarah, have talosh, it's considered disconnected. Dama Rav says, Amishtachabe le'bayis shalo osro. If a person bows down, prostrates himself to his home, to his house, he makes the house avodah zarah. It's osro. And if it enters your mind that something disconnected and then connected is connected, Elohim alaharim v'lo Elohim, period. Well, I'm going to explain all this in a second. So if you remember from Masechta Avodah Zarah, the pasuk says, what is it? V'kol mekomos asher avdu sham. What does it say? Abed taibdunes kol mekomos asher avdu sham agoyim asher atem yarshiv osam es Elohim alaharim. So we make a droshe in Masechta Avodah Zarah. Elohim alehorim v'lo yahorim Elohim. Their gods are on the mountains, but the mountains themselves are not their gods. So, in order for something to be a getchke, for something to be avodah zarah, it has to be considered separate from the mountain, disconnected from the mountain. Now, the shaila is, what if you build a house on a mountain or, on a street or where you build a house, right? I mean, generally speaking, I think, in terms of the distinction between metaltalin and karka, a house would be considered karka. It's not movable, it's connected to the ground. However, in terms of avodah zarah, it's not a mountain. A house, how do you make a house? I don't know. I've never made a house. Let's assume that to make a house, you take wood that's been from trees that are chopped down, disconnected from the ground, and you take lots of wood and you connect them in all sorts of different ways, and you have a house. The point being, yes, the house is connected to the ground, and it's made up of things that were disconnected from the ground, which were then reconnected to themselves and reconnected to the ground, and now it doesn't move, it stays connected to the ground. However, Rav says, if one bows down to a house, he makes the house into avodah zarah, because something that has been disconnected to the ground and then reconnected to the ground is considered disconnected to the ground. It's not considered the ground. If it was considered the ground, the pasuk says the mountain is not avodah zarah. But here we're saying that the house is avodah zarah. Clearly, we are not considering it to be part of the ground. We're considering it to be separate from the ground. Let's read it again. On my Rav, it says, Rav Pshita Li, it's obvious to me, Talush Ulvasov Chibro, that when you have something disconnected from the ground, that you then reconnect to the ground, in terms of avodah zarah, it will be considered disconnected from the ground, and therefore can be avodah zarah. The Amar Rab says, Rav Mishtachve Libayis Shaloi, if a person bows down to his house, also he makes it avodah zarah, makes it also because of avodah zarah, which clearly therefore means that the house is considered separate from the ground, from the earth. If it would be considered part of the ground, Elohim al Elohim, we say that avodah zarah is on the mountains, but the mountains themselves are not avodah zarah. So clearly the house is considered separate from the ground, from the earth, and therefore things that have been disconnected from the ground remain considered, or continue to be considered disconnected from the ground, even once they've been reconnected to the ground. Now, le'inyan hechsher zra'im, with regard to hechsher zra'im, Tanoi, it's a machlokes Tanoim. Friends, let's talk about hechsher zra'im. We talked about it a little bit the other day when we talked about having fruits on the roof and then dew got on the fruits. Now we are going to get a little bit more into depth. Okay, let's talk about hechsher zra'im. Hechsher zra'im, what is it? It is that when you have, let's say, fruits, and the fruits are connected to the ground, those fruits are unable to be makabel tumah. Once those fruits have been disconnected from the ground, they still are unable to become tummy, at least not yet. If a dead sheretz falls on those fruits, we're talking about tumas ochlin, and if a dead sheretz falls on those fruits will remain tahor. They have to be muchsher l'kabel tumah. For them to become muchsher l'kabel tumah, prepared, let's say, ready and now able to become tamid, to be mikabel tumah, they have to come in contact with one of the 7 liquids. We talked about the 7 liquids the other day. We won't list all of them now. Maybe we'll list some of them. But, dew, we saw dew the other day. We'll talk about rainwater today. There's also milk, honey, oil. Okay. Now, if these fruits came into contact with one of the 7 liquids, now they are muchsher l'kabel tumah. If now a dead sheretz falls on these fruits, they will become tummy. The sheretz is an avatumah, they'll be a rishon l'tumah. However, there is more to the story. We had said the other day, the pasuk says, Ki yutan mayim al zera. Right? The drasha is that it's written yitain, but it's read yutan. Just like yitain, just like when you give something to somebody, you desire to give something to somebody. So also when this liquid gets on these fruits, it has to be desirable. If you had no interest in these fruits getting wet, right? What could be an interest in getting the fruits wet? You want to wash them, let's say. You want to wash the fruits. You had an interest in getting the fruits wet. If you did not, if a fruit fell into a bucket of water, you didn't have an interest in getting that fruit wet. We're going to talk more about that in a second. But the point is that you have to have an interest in getting the fruit getting wet. Also, you have to desire it. So therefore, the point is that even when these fruits get wet, after they've been disconnected from the ground, when they're connected to the ground, who cares that they got wet? All fruits get wet when they're hanging on the tree. Once they've been disconnected from the ground, they then need to come into contact with water. Once they come into contact with water, they're muchni l'kabel tumah, but it has to be desirable. Now, the first Mishnah in Masechta Machshirin describes that for mashkim to be machshir fruits l'kabel tumah, it has to be whether tchilaso l'ratzon or sofo l'ratzon. Whether it was initially desirable or ultimately desirable. Ultimately desirable is that you wanted the fruits to get wet. Let's say you wanted to wash the fruits. Initially desirable could mean that even if you didn't want the fruits to get wet, they fell into a bowl of water. You didn't intend for them to get wet, but they could still be muchni l'kabel tumah if it was tchilas l'ratzon. If there was initial desire. What does that mean, initial desire? This is important for the sugya that we're going to discuss right now. Say it's raining. Say it is raining. And you say, okay, it's raining outside. I have an idea. I have a bowl that I want to get washed. I have a bowl. I want to wash this bowl. Let me take this bowl and put it on the roof. And that way, the rainwater, will wash my bowl for me. So here you have a desire for this water. Water, of course, being one of the 7 liquids that will be machshir fruit l'kabel tumah. So here you have a desire for this water because you want the water to wash your bowl. And importantly, your bowl is metaltalin. It's talush. It's not connected to the ground. It's a bowl. So if you take this bowl and you put it on your roof and the rainwater washes your bowl for you, which is exactly what you wanted, and now there is rainwater that is collected in that bowl, that would be tchilas l'ratzon, that the water was kind of collected, was disconnected from its source, which I guess would be the clouds, I don't know. And now you have this water that was collected essentially l'ratzon, you wanted it because you wanted it to wash your bowl. If now fruit falls into that bowl, even if you didn't intend for the fruit to fall into the bowl, you maybe didn't even want the fruit to fall into the bowl, but it fell into water that had been collected for a desirable purpose to wash that bowl, it will be machshir the fruits l'kabel tumah. So there were two ways that this fruit can become muchni l'kabel tumah. One is that you wanted to wash the fruit, and therefore it's muchni l'kabel tumah. Secondly, even if you didn't want to wash the fruit, but it fell into water that you had wanted to collect that water for the purpose of metaltalin, say to wash a bowl, if the fruits fall into that water, it will be muchni l'kabel tumah. Friends, let's take a look at the Gemara right now. I just want to point out one more thing. As I did mention a minute ago, we said that when you want the rainwater to wash your bowl, it's significant that bowl is talush. That bowl is something that is not connected to the ground. If, however, you wanted to wash something that was disconnected and then connected, like a wall, for example, a wall that you built, then that is where we're going to see a question in just a second. Here we go. Le'inyon hechsher zroim. When it comes to machshirin, tanoi, it's a machlokes, tanoim, whether talush l'vasof chibro is considered connected to the earth or not, and if it's considered connected to the earth, then it will not be machshir the water to be machshir the fruits. If it's considered disconnected, then it would be machshir the fruits. Now, this we learned in a Mishnah Masechta Machshirin hakofe kaire ala koisel. If it's raining outside, and a person takes a plate and he puts the plate outside and he leans the plate against a wall. Now, of course, this wall is a wall that was built. A wall that was built with materials that were initially disconnected to the ground, but then you put all these materials together to create the wall, and it's now built into the ground. The question is it considered disconnected from the ground or connected to the ground? Now, anyways, It's raining outside, you take a plate and you lean the plate against the wall. The question is, why'd you do that? If it's bishvil shetudach, if you lean the plate against the wall so that the wall will get a bath. No, so that the plate will get a bath. So that the plate will get rinsed off. Well then, since you desired that water you wanted that rainwater to wash the vessel, well then, areza b'chiyuton, if that water then goes from that plate, if the water from that vessel, from that plate, now got on any fruits, those fruits will be muchni l'kabel tumah, whether you like it or not, because the water that got on them was water that you had wanted for the purpose of metalton, for the purpose of the plate. B'shvil shelo yilke akaisel, but if you put the plate and leaned it against the wall because you did not want the wall to get ruined in the rain, I don't know, for some reason something would have got ruined in the rain and you took a plate and by leaning it against the wall you prevented that ruining. Okay. So in that case you don't want the rainwater for the plate. You also don't want the rainwater for the wall either. You simply don't want the wall to get damaged, so you put a plate there. Well, in that case, if water from the plate comes in contact with fruits, and you didn't have any intention for the fruits to get wet, well, they got wet with water that you also had no intention to collect, and therefore they would not be muchshir l'kabel tumah. Whereas if you put the plate there so that the wall would not get ruined, eno b'chiyuton, this would not be kiyuton mayim alzera. This would not be machshir the fruits l'kabel tumah. Hagufa kasha. Now the Gemara says that this Mishnah is inherently a stira of the Reisha and the Seifa. How come? Well, on the one hand, in the Reisha, Amrat, you said, Bishvil Shetudach. In the Reisha, you said that if the intention is for the plate to be washed in the rain, Hareze b'chiyuton, well, since you desired the rainwater to wash the plate, so that water, if it comes in contact with fruits, will be machshir l'kabel tumah, implying habeshvil sheyudach hakosel. But if the intention was not to wash the plate, but to wash the wall, ein ze b'chiyuton, any water that was collected will not be machshir fruits l'kabel tumah. Right? We said if the water was collected to wash the plate, it will be machshir l'kabel tumah. But implying if it was collected to wash the wall, it would not be machshir l'kabel tumah, implying that the wall is considered connected to the ground. It's not considered talush, it's considered mechuber, connected to the ground. And therefore, any water that was collected for the wall, to wash the wall, would not be machshir l'kabel tumah. The harder tani, but then you said, b'shvil shelo yilka akosel en b'chiyuton. But then the Seifa says, when is it not machshir? When is it not b'chiyuton? If the desire was simply to prevent the wall from getting damaged. The implication being, habishvil sheyudach akosel, if the purpose, however, was that you wanted to wash off the wall, hareze b'chiyuton. It would be kiyuton, right? If the intention was just to prevent damage from the wall, it would not be machshir l'kabel tumah. But if the implication is if the intention was to wash off the wall, well then it would be machshir l'kabel tumah, implying that the wall is considered disconnected from the ground. It's considered talush, and therefore the water that was collected to wash it would be machshir peres l'kabel tumah. So from the Reisha, it implies that the wall would be mechuber, and the Seifa is mashma that the wall is considered talush. Amar Rebbe Lazar says, Rebbe Lazar taver misheshana zoi lo shana zo. Says Rebbe Lazar, it's a machlekes Reisha and the Seifa. Clearly, whoever taught the Reisha is a different Tana than whoever taught the Seifa. And that's what Rava says, that when it comes to machshirin, it's a machlekes about whether talush l'vasof mechuber is considered connected to the ground, right? Talush l'vasof chibro is connected to the ground. Rava says that when it comes to machshirin, it's a machlekes, because the Reisha would have you think that it is connected to the ground. The Seifa would have you think that it is disconnected from the ground. I think I got that right. Okay, so it's a machlekes. I'm going to take a shluck of tea and we'll go weiter. Now, Rab Popit, Rab Popit says Rab Popit Amr Kula Chad Tanahu. You could actually say it's all one Tana. Habakosel Mayre, Habakosel Binyan. It depends if we're talking about the wall of a cave that obviously is considered connected to the ground, right? If you dig out a cave, or if you find a cave, it's part of the mountain. You didn't build it, it was always there. So of course it's considered part of the ground, right? Bekan Bakosel Binyan. The other one is if you build a wall, says Rav Papa, everyone would agree that would be considered disconnected from the ground. If it was talish l'vasof kibro, it would be considered disconnected. V'achikamer, this is how to understand the Mishnah. Hakoife kaire ala kosel. If a person leans a plate against the wall, bishvil sheturach, to wash the plate, hareze b'chiyuton. So of course, any water collected in the plate will be machshir fruits l'kabel tuma, whether you intended for them to be washed or not. Ha-bishvil sheyurach hakosa, implying that if it's to wash the wall, ein ze b'chiyuton, well then it would not be machshir the fruits l'kabel tuma, but mitzvah mamurim b'kosel mayre. That is, if we're talking about the wall of a cave, which is certainly considered part of the ground. Ava b'kosel binyan, but if we're talking about the wall of a building, a wall that was built that is talosh v'sof chibro, of course that is considered disconnected. B'shvil shelo yilke kosel, if the point of the plate was just to protect the wall, who de'eno b'chiyutan, well then it would not be kiyutan, because you don't have any intention, you don't have any positive intention, right? You're just trying to prevent the wall from getting damaged. However, but if the purpose is to wash that wall, well then, it would be machshir, any water that was collected would be machshir fruits the kabatum, because that wall is considered disconnected from the ground. So therefore, the first way to understand it would be to say that it's a machlekes. The other way to understand it would be to say that a wall that was built would be considered tolush when it comes to hechsher zroim by Rava. Rava asks, tolush l'vasof chibul in shchita mai. What about when it comes to shchita? My tashma. Okay, meaning, so if, for example, you take a knife that was disconnected and you stick it into the wall, so when it comes to shchita, is it considered disconnected, in which case it's a kosher shchita, or is it considered connected to the ground, in which case it becomes more controversial? So my tashma, come in here. Hayatzur yotze min kosel. If you had a flint sticking out of the wall, and we want to assume for now that it was disconnected and you connected it to the wall, or if you had a reed sticking out of the ground, v'shachat bo, and you slaughtered with it, shchitasu psula, the shchita is psula, and we want to say that, well, you see, if it's disconnected and then connected, right, the flint was disconnected, you connected it to the wall, and we're saying that it's psula, so it sounds like by shchita it would be considered connected to the wall. So no, that's talking about the wall of a cave that had some sharp stones sticking out of it, and we're saying that is unacceptable. Because it's also being compared in that brisa to a reed that's sticking out of the ground. So we're talking about that it naturally was sticking out of the wall, not that it was separately connected to the wall. Toshma, come, and here na'atz sakin bekoso. If you take a knife and you stick it into the wall of a shachat ba and you slaughter with it shchita sukshera, it is a kosher shchita. So that would imply that if it's separate and you connect it to the wall, it's considered separate. Shiny sakin delo mevatole. No, you could say that a knife is unique because it's unique. It doesn't become bottle, and therefore it would not be considered part of the wall. But maybe like a shard of glass or something might be considered part of the wall. Or flint. Tashma, coming here, b'mechuber lekarka shchitasu kshera, that we say that when it's mechuber lekarka, and we explained yesterday that mechuber lekarka was talking about talush ulevasof chibro, and we're saying that it's kshera, implying that it's considered disconnected. But dilma parusha kamafarish law. Maybe if you keep on reading in that price, immediately afterwards it says. It talks about the knife, so maybe my mechuber lekarka sakin delo mevatole. Maybe when it's saying mechuber lekarka, maybe it's specifically talking about the scenario that's described immediately afterwards, the knife. And yes, the knife is considered disconnected because it's unique, but maybe other things connected to the ground would be considered part of the ground. Anyways, it's inconclusive when it comes to shechita. If you disconnected something and then connected it, we want to say that it's inconclusive. At least this little chunk of Gemara. Yesterday we said if it was disconnected and then connected, Rabbi had said Rabbi would say that it's kosher b'diavad. Rabbi would say it's kosher l'chatchila. But this we're saying it's inconclusive. And now we get up to the final section of today's daf: slaughtering with a knife connected to the wall. Says the Gemara. We said no'as sakin b'kosel v'shachad ba shchitas u'ksher. If one connects a blade to a wall, and now you have a blade sticking out of the wall, the shechita is kshera. Amar of Anan, says of Anan, Amar Shmuel, lo shanu ela she hasakin l'mayla v'tzaver behemat lemata. For that to be kosher, the neck of the animal would have to be below the knife. We're concerned. Let's go weiter. Avol sakin lemata v'tzaver behemat lemayla. If the neck of the animal is above the blade of the knife, chashin shema yidros, we are concerned you may press down on the knife, and that would be, what was it? Drasa, I think, is what. It was definitely something like that. Wait, it's called, so let me make sure I'm pronouncing it right. It's called drasa, yeah. That would be drasa. Okay, so we are concerned that you might press down on it. So for that to work, the neck would have to be below the knife. Okay. But we learn in a brayso. I'm going to add a few words here. Then you could slaughter with anything. Bein betalush, bein b'mechuber. Whether disconnected, whether connected. Bein she'asakin lemata, v'tzaver bein l'mayla. And we said whether the knife is below and the neck is above. Bein she'asakin l'mayla, v'tzaver bein l'mata. And whether the knife is above and the neck of the animal is below. So it sounds like from this brayso that either way you can slaughter, whether the neck is below or above the knife. Rav Zvid litztadin katani. Says Rav Zvid, you have to write the Mishnah. That brayso essentially said four things: bein betalush, bein b'mechuber. Whether the neck is above, whether the neck is below. So you have to basically, it's like 1, 3, 2, 4 kind of thing, right? It's like in computer programming when you have an equal sign in the middle and you have two variables on one side and then you have two values on the other side. So basically, it's called dynamic assignment or something. Anyways, so Amar Rav Zvid litztadin katani sakin lemata v'tzaver behema lemayla betalush. You can have the neck above the blade of the knife. You can have the blade below and the neck above when we're talking about a knife that is not connected to a wall. So you can have the neck above the blade in that scenario. Sakin l'mayla v'tzaver behemat lemata, when we're talking about the knife above and the neck below and slaughtering downwards, b'mechuber, that could work even when it's connected, even when the knife is connected to the ground. Certainly, connected to the wall. Certainly, it could work when you have just a knife. You could slaughter down at the neck as well. I think that's probably the standard way to do it. Rav Papa says that actually you can even say that when the knife is connected to the wall, you could still slaughter with the neck above the knife, but for birds. For a bird, which you can move around more freely, so you can even have the knife connected to the wall and have the neck of the bird above, because you can move them around more easy. But to have a sheep or a cow or something, we're concerned you might end up pushing down. That would be drosa. There are 5 things shell that they say about the stem of a reed. Ein sharchtim ba. You can't slaughter with it. Ein malin ba. Don't do bris milah with it. Ve'ein mechatchin ba baso. You don't cut meat with it. Ve'ein mechatzitzin ba shinaim. Nor do you pick your teeth with it. Ve'ein mekanchim ba. Nor do you clean yourself with it. We'll have to explain what that means. Now, the reason being that when it comes to this reed, it can splinter, and therefore we don't want you using it when it can be splintering while you're cutting with it. And shochten, but what do you mean you don't slaughter with it? What do you mean? We said you're allowed to slaughter with the stem of a reed. Amar Rab Papa be simuna de agma. Essentially, if it's a reed that is firm and won't splinter, you can slaughter with that. We say that you don't cut meat with a reed because it could splinter into your meat and be dangerous when you eat it. Rav Papa would, however, cut open fish intestines with it because they are clear and you would be able to see any splinters if there were any. Rabbi Ravuna would cut bird meat with it because bird meat is softer and it wouldn't splinter the reed. And we don't you don't clean yourself with it. The assumption is it means clean yourself after you go to the bathroom. After you defecate, don't clean yourself with this reed. But we should know that simply because we said that if somebody cleans themselves after going to the bathroom with something that can light on fire, like a reed that is flammable, well, the ridges in one's rectum will come out. We're not talking about going to the bathroom. We're talking about if a person has a wound, don't clean the wound with a reed because you can get splinters in the wound. Friends, that was Daf Tes Zayin, Daf 16 of Masechta Chullin. On Daf 16 of Masechta Chullin, we learned about slaughtering with a muchni. That was that blade wheel. We said two ways, right? So on the one hand, we said yesterday it's kosher, but there's a brayso which says it's possible. The question is, how do we resolve this? One resolution is to say a potter's wheel is kosher because a potter's wheel requires a human to turn the wheel. So the slicing is essentially being affected by a human, and therefore it's kosher. But a water wheel, where the wheel, the blade wheel is being turned by the current of the water, so then that is possible because there's no human koach, no human force there. There was, however, another suggestion that says no, even with a potter's wheel, even with a water wheel, it could actually work. That when you remove anything blocking the current from the water wheel, that initial the gush of water that will turn the water wheel, which will in turn turn the blade wheel, that initial rotation of the blade wheel is coming from a human action, the human action removing the thing that was blocking the current. So that initial rotation, if you shecht with that is acceptable, but the subsequent rotations are not coming from the human, they're coming from the water current, and they would be unacceptable. We discussed connected and then connected and then reconnected, disconnected and then reconnected items. We discussed it in the context of avodah zara. We said they're considered disconnected. So, for example, if you bow down to your house, it's avodah zara. Even though if you bow down to a mountain, it's not avodah zara. If you bow down to your house, it is avodah zara because it's made from materials that were disconnected and then reconnected to the ground. It's considered disconnected and it is avodah zara. By hechsher zroim, we saw two ways of understanding it. One way to understand it, let me just fix something here. Okay. One way to understand it was Rava, who said it's a machlokas based on Rabbi Lazar, who noted a discrepancy between the Reisha and the Seifa of a Mishnah in Masechta Machshirin. And one way to understand it was, so Rava understands that it's a machlokas about whether you have a wall that was made from materials that were at one point disconnected from the ground, whether they're considered talush, in which case they can be machshir food l'kabel tuma, or mechuber, in which case they would not. And Rav Papa says that they are considered disconnected from the ground. And then by shchita, it was inconclusive whether something that was disconnected, let's say a flint that was disconnected from the ground, then reconnected to a wall, would it be considered connected or not? It was inconclusive. And finally, slaughtering with a knife connected to the wall, Shmuel says that the neck must be beneath the knife, because if the neck is above the knife, we're concerned you might push down on the knife. and that would be drasa, that would be a problem. Rav Papa says that truth is, even when it comes to, you can even have the neck above the knife. However, it would be for birds where you have more control over the movement of the bird, and to make sure that it's a slicing action rather than a pressing action. Friends, that was Daf 16, Daf Tez Zayin, Masechta Chulin. Of course, I hope you enjoyed yourselves. I'll catch you tomorrow.